Welcome, everybody. Welcome to this new segment here at Greek University. We have decided to call this Making Hazing History with Mike and Hank. I'm your host, Mike Ayalon, founder and CEO of Greek University. My co-host today is none other than Hank Nuwer. He has been described as one of the nation's foremost authorities on hazing. He is the author of Hazing, Destroying Young Lives, Wrongs of Passage, High School Hazing, and The Hazing Reader. Hank has written about hazing from 1978 all the way through his semi-retirement in September of 2018. Now he's speaking on college campuses all over North America and all over the world, I might add, about his research. So we thought it would be helpful for our audience to learn a little bit more about that history of hazing. And we were going to put that in a video and audio format, so that way you can enjoy this, you can share this with others, just a real easy, digestible version of getting all of the history and all of the research that Hank has done up until this point. So we're really excited to launch this new resource for all of you. So thank you so much for joining us today, Hank. It's good to have you back.
It's great to be here and ready to go.
Excellent. All right. Well, let's just jump right in. I think the first question that our audience would have for you, somebody who's done extensive amounts of research on hazing, tell us, what was the first hazing death in a fraternity?
The first hazing death occurred in 1873 with the Kappa Alpha Society. It was the death of Mortimer Leggett, who was 18 years old. And his was at a time when the initiations were rough in terms of paddling, in terms of ducking people's heads under a pump. This one was relatively tame, although, as we'll talk about, newspapers at the time really sensationalized it and had the young men across as demons. So, Mike, are you familiar with a walkabout or taking someone off on a trip as a hazing practice?
No, tell me more about that. And I also want to know, what year are we talking about here?
Okay, this was 1873.
Okay.
And one of the hazing procedures, which has continued in some groups today, is to take someone out in the country. There's two ways of doing it. One was to exhaust the person, and at Cornell it's full of gorges and ice age chasms, and so you can be pretty tired as you're marching through it. The second one that's done, with a lot of fatalities, is dropping someone off in the country and alone, and that has led to problems with a drunk driver hitting the person or being in the dark. Grove City College actually had 4 deaths at one time when a car hit the marching group and plowed right into the whole group. So there have been quite a few deaths. It doesn't sound dangerous, but it is. And we can look at the consequences. But here at Cornell, it was to take someone on, Mortimer Leggett, on a trip all throughout the gorge area. And it was at night. The title of my chapter is Ill Met by Moonlight, which you might recognize from Midsummer Night's Dream, which I acted in actually when I was in college. And Ill Met by Moonlight because they went out without any torches. Of course, there were no flashlights at that time. And the young man was blindfolded. So this was what led to a lot of the bad publicity at the time, was the fact that he was blindfolded. In my research, I had to go into coroner's reports and investigations to pull that out, because the existing history of Cornell said that there wasn't a blindfold at the time. But the evidence contradicts that there really was. Anyway, they took a break and were waiting for another pledge to come, who was very close by. And they waited at the precipice of a cliff. Whether they intended to take the blindfold off and scare him as he looked down, which I think might be likely. We don't know for sure, but he was at the edge with two other brothers. One who had been initiated, Charles Lee, the semester before. One was a veteran named Charles Wason, who to this day subsequently became the biggest donor of East Asia artifacts to Cornell University. He's a major alum, passed away now, of course, but a major alum. At some point, and again, we weren't there, the three toppled over the cliff 40 to 50 feet, and Leggett landed on his face. Charles Lee was injured, Charles Wason was injured, but Leggett landed in a terrible way and was, in fact, his neck was described as crooked and thrown off, and he perished. They took him to a hotel where, ironically, they were to have a midnight repast, the formal initiation into Kappa Alpha Society, with all the candles and everything else, which would have been very, very pleasant. And his body was brought there, and he died. So a lot of terror for those young people. Of course, they had to find a wagon to transport him, which was not all that easy.
Mm-hmm.
That's the episode, Mike, right there.
Wow. So was there an investigation that was done after this incident?
Yes, there was I think was an important part of my chapter. There was a coroner's inquiry, but the coroner appointed so many of the men, no women, who had connections to Cornell University, a treasurer, alums, former students, business people connected with the school. And so that got some deserved criticism at the time. Mm-hmm. But as I said, the New York Sun, probably the biggest violator, had demons around the edge of a cliff, calling the students demons. There, an illustration had a bonfire coming out as if they were at some kind of satanic ritual, and it got a big national headlines. Mm-hmm. The next reason it got all the headlines is that Mortimer Leggett's father, Mortimer Leggett Sr., was a Civil War hero. He was a general who was at Corinth, at Atlanta, and had horses shot out from underneath him, was very, very popular with his troops. And he was a federal patent attorney and very well known, and also an educator, and was very well known in the United States. So that got a lot of attention. And then finally, what else got attention is that he accepted membership into the chapter in place of his son. And that also led to a lot of headlines.
Wow. So in your research, since we're talking about Cornell, were there other incidents where there was a death as well on that campus?
Yeah, 1899, Kappa Alpha Society had someone go off of a train on another excursion into the woods. The young man, his name was Edward Berkeley, did not know that there was a water, like a pond nearby, and drowned. The last anyone saw of him was his hat floating, so they knew where he was. So it's two initiations that would seem not deadly, but had the same consequences. So I think that's really significant. Same chapter, same school, 2 deaths. And in between, Cornell had a freshman-sophomore hazing in which Cornell was released into a freshman banquet, and it killed a server, Henrietta Jackson. Mm-hmm. And that's another story that we might talk about sometime.
Yeah, I think that's an important lesson for our listeners that are listening. And as we talk about and we frame up fraternity and sorority today, is those unintended consequences. and that I think deserves a little bit more exploration because, I think a lot of fraternity and sorority members that I talk to, certainly they would say to me, well, it's kind of the little h hazing, right? Yes, there is some hazing that occurs, but nothing that is going to get anybody injured or anything like that. And I think as we start getting into some of your hazing research, and as we do some more of these types of interviews, I think that really is kind of that overriding message of the unintended consequences, right?
It is. And I think the message that I try to get across is do something risky long enough, and sooner or later, something untoward is going to occur. And the fact that they did this in the dark, uh, uh, that was dangerous. The fact that they went to the edge of a cliff, that was dangerous. Uh, it could have been avoided.
Right.
There was no reason they had to be going out in the dark.
Mm-hmm.
And Leggett, of course, was exhausted. They had been parading him around. They
Mm-hmm.
told him to wear his knockabout clothing, so they knew he was going to be falling somewhat and would be roughed up a little bit and exhausted at the end, and then would get to the initiation, would be greeted by, including one of the professors, greeted and toasted, and the evening would end well. But it, of course, ended horrifically.
Right. It almost seems as if some colleges and universities that there is some kind of a hazing culture that exists. So is that something that your research has turned up as well, that there is maybe a hazing culture in certain areas of the country or certain campuses?
I think that's really, really true of Cornell, among other schools. And this is really interesting to me because I was allowed to be part of a committee uh, back in the day when Travis Apgar was working at Cornell some years ago,
Mhm.
looking into hazing. So I know firsthand that Cornell has really tried to fight it. A former president at Cornell had written an anti-hazing editorial for the New York Times, but it keeps coming up. And we had the death of a young man named Cialis just last year at Cornell, who was at a kind of Christmas party, and the parents are asking for more investigations and saying that they believe that it's hazing related. And so that one is still has yet to be fully investigated, that particular death. But Cornell has had these deaths over time, and many, many, many hazing incidents
Mhm.
over time. And so it's kind of ironic. Uh, a school that has fought it as hard as Cornell has, and that includes the undergrads. There's a
Right.
lot of anti-hazing advocates among the undergraduates. It just seems to continue. Uh, we're looking at alumni influences. We're looking at quote unquote tradition. Um, we're looking at the fact that it seems to be equating hazing and pledging as the same thing, which of course it shouldn't be.
Right. Yeah, that's just so interesting to me because Travis is a good friend of mine. I know he's a very good friend of yours, and a champion for hazing prevention. And even today, they have incredible people on the administration that I respect and I admire for their
Sure.
work in hazing prevention. And I know Travis is one of them.
Yeah,
Over the years.
he's moved on to another campus.
Right. Yes, I'm aware, but I mean,
Mm.
it's amazing to me to see the quality of the men and women that have really tried to address this over the years. I guess that's what I'm getting at.
That's exactly.
And that for some reason, the culture sometimes keeps creeping back, despite all of these amazing people that I consider to be friends and people who I admire within the hazing prevention realm.
Sure, and as part of the culture, as you know, one of the books I'm doing now is a biography of Kurt Vonnegut. He was in Delta Upsilon at Cornell, and he even wrote about hazing in a light way for the Cornell Sun when
Mm,
he was a member of the student newspaper.
mm,
So I talked with Vonnegut before his death about hazing, and his impression was, well, we didn't take it too far at
mhm.
that time. And that's what you're talking about with unintended consequences. when everything goes right, there's no death.
Right.
And when it goes wrong, everyone assumes it's been taken too far.
Right.
But Lady Luck, or the way the stars align, has something to do with this as well.
Wow, that's really powerful. I appreciate you sharing that story. I think that's a really incredible story. Where can our listeners go to find out more about Mortimer Leggett and some of the things that occurred during this first hazing death in a fraternity?
Okay, well, it's the opening chapter to Hazing, Destroying Young Lives. And in that book, I've written several chapters, and we have contributors, Travis Apgar, who we've talked about.
Hmm.
Uh, we have uh, we have people from the Greek world. We have Bob Biggs from Phi Delta Theta. We have attorneys. We have others who've contributed chapters. And so I've tried to have a womb to tomb look uh, at hazing. We have chapters on sexual hazing, which Norm Pollard contributed. I mainly see myself as a hazing historian. And so a lot of the story, and I'm a storyteller. And so a lot of mine are involved around research, going back to the schools, going to the libraries, the dusty libraries, the old archives, and pulling things up. And this is actually an amazing story. The inquest I told you about, I went on a whim to the courthouse to ask if they kept any old records of coroner's inquests. The district attorney said, probably not, but I'll check for you. An hour later, came down with an armload, a box load of materials. And so that was amazing to me.
That is amazing. I've read that chapter about Mortimer in your book, and I think it's absolutely fantastic. It really does give you a play-by-play of what happened that particular evening, and just from all different angles, from the media reports, from just all the different angles there. And I think it's really fascinating. I can't wait to get into the rest of the book, because you're right. All of the people that you have in that book are really experts in their field, and it's really an impressive list. So I can't wait to digest some more chapters in the book. But yeah, that's a great place for our listeners to go. So this has been fantastic. I've learned a lot, as I always do every time that we talk. So I appreciate your time. And hopefully if our listeners like it, please feel free to share this. And we look forward to seeing you next week on a similar episode here of Making Hazing History with Mike and Hank. Thanks so much for joining us today, and we'll see you next time. Take care.